Good morning, and thank you all so much for joining the Hudson Library for our virtual author program with best-selling author and professor of art history, Dr. Noah Charney. He's joining us this morning for a conversation about his recently published book, The Thefts of the Mona Lisa. And before I introduce our author this morning, I just want to take a moment and mention we do have a lot of upcoming programs coming up here at the Hudson Library, both virtual and in person, especially since I have our art audience with us this morning. I'll mention we have a lot of upcoming art and art history programs in the month of April. So take a look at the library's website at hudsonlibrary.org. You can take a look at all we have coming up and register online there as well. Well, joining us this morning is Dr. Noah Charney. He's an internationally best-selling author of more than a dozen books and a professor of art history specializing in art crime at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. His first novel, The Art Thief, has been translated into 17 languages. He's also a columnist, TV presenter, and the founder of the Association for Research into Crimes Against Art. As a journalist, he contributes regularly to The Guardian, The Daily Beast, The Atlantic, The Art Newspaper, The Washington Post, and Esquire. His book, Collector of Lives, Giorgio Vasari and the Invention of Art, was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. And we have copies available for purchase, copies of The Thefts of the Mona Lisa available for purchase courtesy of the Learned Owl in Hudson. And we have a link in the chat if you'd like to purchase your copy today. So Dr. Charney, thanks so much for your time today. We are very much so looking forward to hearing more about the thefts of the Mona Lisa and of course your background as a art history professor in art crime. That sounds very interesting. I'd love to hear more about that too.
Thank you so much, Allison. Thanks for having me, and thanks to all of you for coming to spend some time with me today. It's a total delight to be virtually spending the next block of time with you. I am living in Slovenia, believe it or not. Am I your first guest author in Slovenia? I'm guessing probably. I've been an expat in Europe for more than a decade now. And my bio's out of date because I now have over 20 books published, but this is the most recent one. And this is a very exciting moment because I give a lot of talks about this subject, but I only now got my own book in the mail today. This is living in Slovenia. It's like on the far side of the Alps. The mail takes a while to get here. So I just got the books today and they're very beautiful. And so I'm delighted to see them in person. Because I've been hearing about them, but I haven't seen it yet. So yes, I am a professor specializing in art crime, which is a very unusual field. And I was the beneficiary of some publicity back in 2006 when I was still a student. And there was a New York Times Magazine article that was saying that I had founded the field of study of art crime. And that seems to be the case because while there had been journalistic accounts of famous art crimes and some books that were usually anecdotal, there wasn't really an academic field in which you could study art crime. And my approach was to look at case studies, most of which we got from journalistic accounts, and try to work backwards and create a science out of analyzing them. And it's easiest to begin with the cases for which we have the most material, and the Mona Lisa theft, because the thief was arrested and put on trial, and trial records have a habit of surviving better than other documents do. We know all about it. And so this is a really good case study. And the idea when I first began as an art historian, switching to, put on a criminologist's hat, was to try to see if we can gather enough case studies to build up data sets. And you want a lot of cases to be able to say anything constructive by analyzing that data about the criminal phenomenon in general. But you start with a dozen cases and then you get to 100. And over time, you start to have thousands of cases available to you. And then you can start to spot trends. And the idea, why do we study history? Well, to not be fooled in the future the way we have been in the past. So this is a famous example. So I'm going to do my magic share screen with you because I have PowerPoint presentation. There's a running joke that art historians only look at books with pictures in them. And we're very worried that nobody would want to actually look at us for a full talk. So we got to have pictures to dazzle you in the background. So what I'm going to do is spend about a half hour talking to you about the theft of the Mona Lisa, the most famous one, but also a couple of other cases related to the Mona Lisa that are interesting and surprise people. And one of them that just about nobody seems to know about is how Picasso was involved in stealing from the Louvre Museum. But to begin with, I want you to imagine it's the 21st of August, 1911, and it's a Monday morning, and a gentle light is filtering through the windows of the Louvre Museum. And locked inside one of the custodian cupboards, basically like a janitor's closet, is a man named Vincenzo Perugia. And he had spent the night hidden in this closet. Now that it was dawn, he was waiting for the footfalls of the security guards to disappear down the hallway. And when it disappeared, he opened the door surreptitiously, snuck out of the closet, and crossed the corridor, then headed to the Salon Café, which is where the Mona Lisa was displayed. And he went straight to the painting, and he removed it from the wall. And he removed it from the wall in such a way that he didn't make a lot of noise. And this should have been a clue for the detectives investigating, because the painting was in a cumbersome, ornate, gilded frame, and it was heavy and difficult to carry. And it was also hung in such a way that, if you didn't know the mechanism by which it was hung, you would be clonking it around trying to get it off the wall. But he did know how it was hung. He headed back out the way he came and went into a staircase that was just for staff. And there he removed the wooden panel. Mona Lisa's painted on an oak panel. And he set aside the frame, wrapped the panel in a white sheet, and headed down the stairs. And his plan was to exit at the bottom of the stairs, cross what's called the Court of the Sphinx, and then disappear into early morning Paris. But when he got to the bottom of the stairs, he reached his hand out to grasp the doorknob, and he twisted, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked from the outside. Now, he tried to force down his sense of rising panic because he thought maybe this would be the case, and he had brought tools with him. He first seems to have tried to remove the door from its hinges to open it and realized that would probably be too noisy. And then he tried to unscrew the doorknob, thinking that that would open the door. He unscrewed the doorknob, put it in his pocket, but the door still wouldn't open. And now he heard footsteps coming down the stairs towards him. Now, if I have you for a really long chat, like a 2-hour event, I would probably pause there at a moment of high drama and take advantage of this and drift off into other subjects when then return to finish up the story. I'm not going to do that to you now because we have a shorter form talk today. So we're just going to cut to the chase. So who was the owner of those footsteps coming down the stairs? It turned out it was a night janitor. And there's no record, unfortunately, of what this night janitor thought of this little guy with a mustache carrying a Mona Lisa-shaped object wrapped in a white sheet tucked under his arm, or why there was no doorknob on the door. But he used his keys and he opened the doorknobless door and opened and let this guy who was dressed in a Louvre worker's uniform out. And apparently it was not so unusual for Louvre staff to be locked in accidentally overnight. And off he went into early morning Paris, and someone who was setting up shop at the Quai de Louvre, which is like a shopping arcade across the street from the museum, later told the police he thought it was odd that a little guy with a big mustache in a Louvre worker's uniform carrying a white sheet under his arm threw something over his shoulder as he disappeared into early morning Paris. And when the police investigated, they found the object that was thrown over his shoulder. It was a doorknob. So this is the story of Vincenzo Perugia's theft of the Mona Lisa. And here's a picture of Vincenzo himself. Vincenzo was an Italian immigrant living in Paris. Paris was the center of the art world, and he was an amateur painter, but he wasn't very good. He was also a mandolin playing enthusiast. I don't know if he was good at that. That hasn't survived the historical records, but he was trying to make a go of it as a painter, but he couldn't get a foothold. And so he had work, odd jobs to keep him in rent and meals. And one of the jobs was that he worked as a handyman for a construction company that had been subcontracted by the Louvre to make protective glass cases to cover the most famous works of art because they were worried that the works might be attacked by anarchists. And so he had access to the Louvre, and he was under the mistaken belief that the Mona Lisa had been stolen from Italy by Napoleon. Now, this was a pretty good guess because Napoleon, during his Italian campaign, which was 1792 to 1797, stole hundreds of thousands of cultural heritage objects. In fact, he was the first general to have a dedicated art theft division of his army that was tasked with boxing up art that he wanted to keep for himself or to send back, capturing for the French state. And they were responsible for stealing literally hundreds of thousands of objects, and many of them are still in the Louvre today. But Mona Lisa was not one of them. Why not? Well, at the end of his life, Leonardo da Vinci moved to France voluntarily and was under the patronage of King Francis I, a French king who was a huge Italianophile. He was a huge fan of all things Italian, and he collected Italian art, and he also collected Italians. So he invited a number of famous artists, including Raphael, Michelangelo, Benvenuto Cellini, Rosso Fiorentino, and Leonardo da Vinci to come and live in France under his patronage, and he would give them a salary, and in exchange, that he would have first dibs on buying any art they created. And Cellini and Rosso Fiorentino and Leonardo da Vinci all accepted this offer and moved to France for blocks of time. And Leonardo died in France under the patronage of the king. And when he died, all of his possessions went to his assistant, whose nickname was Salai. And from the estate of Salai, Francis I bought some works by Leonardo that he liked, and one of them was the Mona Lisa. So, what was Mona Lisa? Mona Lisa is a painting that is a portrait of a woman named Lisa Gherardini. It's called La Gioconda or Le Joconde in French because it was commissioned by her husband, who was named Francesco del Giocondo. So, La Gioconda in Italian is a sort of cute way of saying the Giocondo woman. And it's likely that the family that commissioned it never actually took possession of the finished work. It was commissioned of Leonardo because Francesco del Giocondo was friends with Leonardo's father, who was a notary. And it was commissioned very early in Leonardo's career as a painter. Incidentally, Leonardo never really thought of himself as a professional painter. He liked painting, but he didn't make a lot of paintings. He earned most of his money as a military engineer and as a professional musician. He was one of the most famous musicians in Europe at the time. He played an instrument called the lira di braccio, which looks sort of like a hybrid between a lute and a guitar. And that's how he made the most money. And he was mostly interested in science. And the reason he liked painting was for the scientific side of it. And he once claimed that he had never finished a single work of art. That's not quite true, but he probably never thought of it as finished. But when he was still young, he began this commission, and he likely was never paid for it. And in the Giocondo family, probably never saw a version of it because he kept on getting called away to do other things that he frankly found more interesting or more lucrative. So he kept the painting with him for his entire life. And there's a lot of evidence that he changed it, sometimes dramatically, over periods of time. In fact, a recent investigation suggests that the way it looks now is very different from the original. And effectively, Leonardo himself painted over it 2 times, quite dramatically changing what the work looks like. What we see is the final version before he died, but it does not actually look like Elisa Gherardini, its subject. So what Vincenzo Perugia had was a crime of opportunity. He thought that he was repatriating Mona Lisa that had been stolen from Italy by Napoleon. And he saw that he had a chance to access the Louvre because he happened to be working for a firm hired by the Louvre. And so he saw this chance and took it. And he was not a career criminal. He didn't have criminal connections, but he did get away with stealing the Mona Lisa. Mona Lisa was already among the more famous works of art in the world, but certainly not the most famous. It was its theft that solidified it as the most famous artwork in the world, which it still is today. It was considered a very good Renaissance portrait. There was a sort of cult of interest in Leonardo da Vinci, especially among Anglophone audiences in the 19th century. But it took the theft to make it a household name. As soon as it was stolen, it made international headlines. And this is at a time that was relatively early in the um, era, the golden age of newspaper coverage. There were loads of newspapers, dailies, magazines, weeklies. And in Paris, this was the talk of the city, and it made international headlines. And the investigation was covered by newspapers the world over. And that's really what helped promote Mona Lisa's international renown. In fact, she would be gone for about 2.5 years, and it was not until the Titanic sank that she was knocked from her perch at the top of the headlines. So this is 1911. As soon as the theft is noticed, which actually took until the next day, Tuesday, the 22nd of August, because on the Monday the Louvre was closed, um, the police locked down the museum, of course, much too late. The director of the Louvre resigned in disgrace, and the prefect of police in Paris, a guy named Louis Lepine, was on the case. And he is quite an interesting character in the history of criminal investigation. He was very well known for being a riot breaker. So he was good at basically maintaining control of public um, events and riots that took place in the streets of Paris. But this would be his indignity and his downfall because he was unable to solve the theft of the Mona Lisa. He, in fact, interviewed Vincenzo Peruggia twice. He interviewed everyone with any connection to the Louvre, and he never considered him a possible suspect. Meanwhile, Vincenzo Peruggia didn't know what to do with the painting. He wound up keeping it in his apartment in the false bottom of a shipping container, and he would take it out when he got home from work each day and lay it on his bed and just stare at it. And he had what we might call reverse Stockholm syndrome. Stockholm syndrome is a phenomenon where a hostage falls in love with the person who took them hostage. This is sort of the opposite. The hostage taker fell in love with the art that he had stolen. And there's some thought that he may have tried to find an American collector who would buy it, or he had a list of wealthy American art collectors in his possession, but he probably realized that he didn't have the connections to pull this off. So he wound up keeping it. And then eventually he decided, you know what, this is driving me crazy. I'm not doing anything. He was morose. He was maybe depressive. He would just come home from work and stare at this painting, and it cast this sort of spell over him. And he finally decided he had to get rid of it for his own health. And so he smuggled it to Florence, Italy, and returned it to Italy. But in the meantime, we have a parallel story I'd like to introduce, and this is one that very few people know about. The guy you see here is Pablo Picasso, a very young Picasso. This is him in 1904, the photo in the middle, when he first moved from Spain to Paris. And on the left, you can see a place called Bateau Lavoir, which means the laundry boat. It's in the Saint-Denis neighborhood of Paris, and it's basically a series of buildings that sort of got unified, and it was a rundown hovel and a squat where lots of artists were staying. It was a mess, rats everywhere. It was thoroughly unpleasant. Kind of imagine a frat house that nobody has kept up for ages. And that's where he lived, and that's where he had his studio for his first part of his life in Paris. And his best friend was Guillaume Apollinaire. Guillaume Apollinaire is the French name for a Polish poet who was also an art critic. And the two were known men about town. They were always partying together at different cafes. And Apollinaire was very influential among writers, and Picasso, even though he was young, was influential and exciting among artists. And early on in his career in Paris, he was doing these sorts of works of art. This is his blue period. You might recognize the guitarist, for example. And then here we have a picture of Apollinaire. He's in the top left and bottom middle, and Picasso. So Picasso moved to Paris in 1904, and in September of that year, he saw some ancient statue heads while attending the opening of a new room at the Louvre, which featured Iberian art. As a proud Spaniard, Picasso was thrilled by the ancient art he saw on display, and the sculptures that he saw had this air of the kind of simplified abstraction that you might associate if you can picture Cycladic figurines that were millennia old but looked abstract and quite modern because they broke down faces and bodies into geometric forms, which is what Picasso would do with his development of Cubism. So the statues that he was admiring were not artistic masterpieces. They were moderately important pre-classical archaeological specimens, but they didn't really have a financial value. But he really admired them in this exhibit. And so if we fast forward a bit, we'll go to 1906. So in 1906, Apollinaire had in his employ as a personal secretary a Belgian by the name of Joseph Honoré Géry Pierret. It's a mouthful of a name. And he was a really quirky character. I'd love to know more about him because, as far as my research could tell, I only found out about his relation to the incident I'm telling you about now, which is called the Affaire des Statuettes or the Statuette Affair. But in fact, he was supposedly a con man who was involved in all sorts of funny activities. He was a kleptomaniac. He was compulsively stealing, and in this period of time, he was compulsively stealing from the Louvre Museum. And at the end of his life, he moved to San Diego before San Diego was San Diego when it was still the Wild West and underpopulated, and he became a cowboy. So it sounds like a really fun character to learn more about. So at this time, he was working effectively as Apollinaire's personal assistant, and he was stealing compulsively from the Louvre. At this time, the Louvre Museum had over 400 rooms, but fewer than 200 guards, and even fewer at night. And there were no alarms. Alarms had been invented, but they were not universally used, and they often were set off accidentally. So that was not a factor in security at the time. And also, objects were usually left out on tables. So you'd have a sculpture that wasn't fixed in place on a plinth or inside a glass vitrine, but just laid out on a table for people to admire. And there had been media grumblings in Paris about, one of these days somebody's going to steal from the Louvre because it's so underprotected. And particularly the liberal media saw the theft of the Mona Lisa as a way to basically say tisk tisk at the conservative government in power that they should let national treasures disappear. But what happened in 1906? Well, there was an event in 1906 that Picasso was certainly involved in, and whether he was an actual thief or just the designer of the theft, that's not entirely clear. But in late 1906, three statue heads that had been on display at that Iberian exhibit in 1904 were stolen from the Louvre by Géry Pierret. And Géry Pierret claimed that he was the only thief, that he didn't know what to steal. He was wandering through the Louvre, he was checking things out, and he said, "Oh, these look nice." And he tucked them under his trench coat. And he had the chutzpah, if you know the term, to stop and ask a security guard for directions to the nearest exit while having three quite cumbersome statue heads tucked under his trench coat. And then he showed them to Picasso, and Picasso claimed that he didn't know that they were from the Louvre, but he quite liked them, so he bought them from Géry Pierret, and he didn't even know they were stolen. This is a load of hooey because he admired these in particular, especially the one in the bottom right with a black background. This one he described very specifically as having admired it in the 1904 exhibit when he saw it. And his girlfriend at the time, Fernande Olivier, who published her memoir, said that it was funny that Picasso had his whole art collection on display in his studio, except for these statue heads, which he kept, hidden away in a sock drawer. Now, let's fast forward a little bit to 1911. The Mona Lisa is stolen, and the police don't have any leads. So, in order to try to shake up some information, newspapers start offering rewards for information leading to the recovery of the Mona Lisa. And one of the newspapers that offers a reward is called Paris Journal. And that's a magazine or newspaper that Guillaume Apollinaire wrote for as the art critic. And who writes a letter? Well, Géry Pierret writes a very funny, grumpy letter saying, this is not the done thing. This isn't how you play cricket. I was thinking about maybe stealing the Mona Lisa, and I've been stealing from the Louvre for years, and now it's going to be much more difficult because they're going to crack down on security. And this is outrageous that someone else stole the Mona Lisa and ruined the Louvre as a source of things to steal from me. That was the gist of the letter that was published in Paris Journal. Now, the police had no good leads on the Mona Lisa theft, but they did know of Apollinaire and Picasso's connection to Géry Pierret. And Géry Pierret was abroad, so they didn't have access to him, but they went and arrested Picasso and Apollinaire and brought them in for questioning. They were questioned separately, and Picasso was so terrified that he claimed he had never seen Apollinaire before. And this was obviously, they were famous best friends who appeared in tabloid newspaper photos and whatnot. And it was obviously he was lying, but he was so scared. And he was scared of being deported. And in fact, Apollinaire was too, because he was a Polish national, a big Francophile. He loved France and wanted to remain there, but he could have been deported. And it was quite clear that the two of them were innocent of the Mona Lisa theft. They were let go. But they were terrified because they were guilty of having stolen other things from the Louvre. So that night, Fernand Olivier explains they went home, they met up at Bateau Lavoir, they got a suitcase, they put the statue heads in a suitcase, and they went out in the middle of the night to throw the suitcase in the Seine River and hide the evidence. But then they came back at dawn with the statues intact. They couldn't bring themselves to get rid of objects they thought so beautiful. So instead, Apollinaire, in disguise, but I imagine this disguise was, like a Groucho Marx nose and mustache and glasses, and everybody knew it was him. Somebody anonymously returned the statue heads to the offices of Paris Journal, where Apollinaire was the art critic, and then they were returned by Paris Journal to the Louvre Museum, and they remain there today. Photos you see are from the Louvre archive. And in this way, they were returned. But the story is a funny one because it is impossible that Géry Pierret's version of the story is true. So one of the issues is the Iberian statues were on display in a temporary exhibit in 1904. By the time it was 1906, they were hidden away in storage. So somebody had to go into Louvre storage and target exactly these statue heads that Picasso admired 2 years prior in order to steal them. It's also logistically, physically impossible for one person to carry all three statue heads. They're not small things, and hide them under a trench coat. There must have been at least one accomplice or one person making multiple trips. And of course, Picasso had admired exactly these, so he knew very well what he was buying from Géry Pierret. And he admitted to it later on, in a sort of indirect manner in a Life magazine interview towards the end of his life, that he had been involved in stealing from the Louvre on this one incident, and he either helped with the crime, or he certainly commissioned the theft. So generally, when we talk about the real history of art theft, I try to downplay the idea of professional, elegant art thieves and collectors of stolen art. These are concepts that are almost exclusively from fiction and film, and we know of very few real life versions of them. But one exception to the rule was Pablo Picasso. Now, this is kind of fun because while Picasso had these statue heads, remember, he had them from end of 1906 until 1911, after the Mona Lisa was stolen. And they proved of great importance to the development of artistic modernism. And you can see the direct inspiration of these statue heads as appearing as the faces of some of the prostitutes in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the 1907 painting by Picasso that's considered his first masterpiece and the first painting of modernism. And they are directly inspired the mask-like faces on the prostitutes in this painting. So without the theft from the Louvre on the part of Picasso, we might not have ever had artistic modernism, or it wouldn't have taken the same form that it did. So what happened to Géry Pierret? I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit because I'm aware of the time. So in 1913, rotund and elegant Florentine art dealer named Alfredo Geri opened a letter that had been sent to him from Paris on the 29th of November. And the letter stated the author was an Italian national who had stolen the Mona Lisa from the Louvre and now wished to return it to his country. and it was an ideological theft. He wanted to right one of the wrongs committed by Napoleon. And the author of the letter would not ask for money, but he said he was a poor man, so if there was some financial compensation, he wouldn't object. And he signed the letter with the name Leonard and only left a street in Paris as his return address. So Geri thought this was a practical joke because for about 2 years, the Mona Lisa theft had been in international headlines. There was no progress. But just in case it was a real lead, he replied. And on a specific day, he and Giovanni Poggi, who was the director of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, went together to a hotel, which is now called Hotel La Gioconda, and you can stay at it today. And they met this short little Italian guy with a nice mustache. Um, and he pulled a suitcase out from under his bed, and it had false bottom, and he opened it, and lo and behold, there was Mona Lisa. And they tried to keep a straight face, and they said, "Okay, can we take this to the Uffizi to be checked by the conservators there to make sure it's authentic, it's not damaged?" The guy said, "No problem," and they left with it. And the next knock at the door led to Vincenzo Perugia's arrest, and he was apparently surprised to have been arrested. He thought he'd be welcomed as a national hero. So the trial that followed, to cut the long story short, Perugia went on trial. He successfully argued that he had nationalistic, ideological, well-meaning reasons for committing this theft. He never intended to deprive the world of the Mona Lisa, and he wanted to always return it to its homeland in Italy. And he was convincing enough that the judge sentenced him to a number of days in prison that was actually fewer than he'd already spent while awaiting the trial and on trial. He was sentenced 380 days in prison, but he had already spent more time than that under arrest since recovering the Mona Lisa, bringing it back to Florence, waiting for the trial and for the trial to complete. So he was released immediately. So he effectively got a slap on the wrist sentence. The Mona Lisa was briefly displayed at the Uffizi. 20,000 people came to see it. Now, that number might not sound like a lot with today's blockbuster international exhibits, but that's a huge amount for people to, pack an exhibit circa 1913. And then it went back to Paris. And there are other adventures. I'm aware of the time. I'm supposed to speak for a half hour, and I've spoken for 28 minutes, so I'm right on time. This is great. But I'll just mention briefly some of the other little adventures around the Mona Lisa that I do talk about in this new book of mine. And if you're interested, then you can read more there. And of course, these stories in much more detail. So one of the things I talk about is whether the Nazis stole the Mona Lisa. And the short version is that the Nazis thought they did, but they probably only stole a copy of it. And everybody likes having the Nazis with the wool pulled over their eyes. That's always a satisfying story. And this is one of them. But what's interesting is there's an official account from the French government about what happened to the Mona Lisa during World War II. But I found another also plausible primary source account of what happened to it that is in contradiction to the Louvre story. And that involves a team of Austrian double agent commandos and a secret Nazi warehouse full of stolen art in the Austrian Alps. And it sounds like it's out of a James Bond movie, and it's a true story. And I think I've come up with a way that synthesizes both the official French national storyline and this other one that I dug up. And there's some other aspects of the Mona Lisa story that I go over in the book. There are all sorts of conspiracy theories, and I go through them and I dismiss the ones that seem dismissible. Almost all of the conspiracy theories are wholly without any grounding. It's not a painting of Leonardo in drag. There are no hieroglyphics in the eyeballs. There's no hidden alligator if you look at it a certain way. There's all sorts of crazy stories, but I think the true version is just as interesting, if not more so. And I also look at some multiple versions of the Mona Lisa and try to understand why some of them appear to have been painted at the same time as the original. One of the things that's intriguing is there are versions of the Mona Lisa that at the surface don't look that similar to what we're used to seeing. but which contain underdrawings, or pentimenti as they're called in Italian, that are identical to the pentimenti in the original. So the original one is at the Louvre in Paris. There's no doubt about that. But there are numerous other versions that were painted around the time that the original was painted. And if you paint a copy of a finished product, then it should look like the finished product without changes made to the development of it, changes in maybe the positioning of a hand or a face turning slightly in one direction. Those are changes that an artist might make while they're developing the concept of the work before they finish it. But if you're copying a finished work, you don't need to make those changes too. But a few of the copies of the Mona Lisa contain the same changes visible when you examine the painting with special light spectra like infrared light and ultraviolet light that allow you to effectively see underlayers of paint without damaging the surface. And they have the same pentimenti, as they're called, that the original does. And this tells us that they were painted simultaneously with the original. And what almost certainly happened is Leonardo was painting the original and he kept making changes and developing it in different ways. And his pupils or assistants who worked in his studio were likewise making changes to their versions of the same painting, standing alongside Leonardo. And each time he made a change, they would make the same change in their version. So there's a lot to unpack here. And in my book, my goal was to have the complete story of the Mona Lisa as an art object and in terms of the various crimes that it was involved in directly or indirectly in one place. And it was a lot of fun to write. And I hope you enjoy it. It's one of more than 20 books that I've published to date. So there's a lot to play with if you're interested in this sort of thing. And I think I'm going to stop here, and we have plenty of time for questions. But thank you so much for taking the time to spend an hour with me. And I would also say a few other things just very briefly. If you're interested in learning more about my work, you're welcome to be in touch via my website, noahcharney.com, or through social media. And if you're interested in studying art crime, I do teach online courses quite often. I teach for Yale University. I teach for Atlas Obscura for the Smithsonian, and you can join me there. And those are more in-depth courses. And then I also, the organization I founded, ARCA, the Association for Research into Crimes against Art, all summer long, every summer, we have what was the first academic program in the world where you could study art crime. And if any of you would be interested in spending a summer in Italy studying art crime at a postgraduate level, then you might consider joining us. And I'll just throw in the chat the link to that, which is artcrimeresearch.org. So I'm going to pass the mic to Allison, and then you can like be the MC, and I'd be happy to answer any questions people have about this or anything else.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I did read your book and it was intriguing and it was one of those I couldn't put down. It was
Oh, that's
so
really nice.
interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just started reading another one of your books too, which is equally as interesting.
Oh,
But one of the things I wanted to ask you in the book, you talked a lot about the idea of an invisible masterpiece, works
mhm.
that are extremely recognizable, but actually not a lot known about it by the general public. Like you said in your book, if you asked anybody what's the most famous painting in the world, most people could say the Mona Lisa, but do they know a lot of in-depth things about the Mona Lisa? And I think that was a really interesting thing. But how is Mona Lisa one of these invisible masterpieces?
It's a great question, and it's probably the most invisible of all those masterpieces because it's something that everybody recognizes. But if you ask them to tell you anything about it beyond its name and its author, they'd probably be hard pressed to come up with something. Maybe they know it's in Paris in the Louvre, but not anything beyond that. And one of the reasons is that it's so ubiquitous. We see it so often. There's a handful of works of art that have this instant recognition at a very superficial level, but then the question is, does anybody know more than that? Another one is Edvard Munch's The Scream. Another one is maybe the Thinker by Rodin, Michelangelo's David. There's a short list that people, if you show them a slide of it, they're going to be able to name it and name the artist, but then what else do they know about it? And I guess it's partly because we have such a familiarity with it that we feel like we know it already, and we don't realize we maybe know very little about it until we have more sort of deeper questioning about it, which doesn't usually come up. You have this, it's effectively a pop culture icon. And the idea that we should know more about it or we need to doesn't really occur unless you're asked directly about it. We also have this habit of people going to the Louvre in order to take a photo of themselves in front of Mona Lisa. But then you'd be surprised how few people actually look at it and how little time they take. It's like about checking off on your list. I got a photo of this. I have proof that I've been there. Bucket list item checked off, but they're like zipping in and out in less than a minute. And I think that's a shame because there's a lot of good stuff there. You can use the fact that it's iconic to your advantage in the sense that it's of interest to everyone. But then once they come to the table to give a chance to maybe learn more about it, that's my goal anyway.
So I'm really interested in hearing more about art crime. How has art crime kind of evolved or changed over time with more technology, more security? Art crime isn't just theft of art. What other types of crime are involved with art?
So when I teach art crime and study it, I look at five different specs. So one is art theft, which is theft from extant collections. One is art forgery, and I teach that separately because while there's a little bit of theoretical overlap, forgery tends to be distinct from art theft because organized crime is rarely involved, whereas organized crime is usually involved with stealing art. Then we also have illicit trade in antiquities, which is looting directly from the earth or sometimes the sea from illicit archaeological sites. And that also is distinct. That's by far the biggest problem when it comes to art crime. And then we also look at iconoclasm and vandalism. Iconoclasm is a fancy word, but it means attacking or destroying an object for its symbolic value, whereas vandalism is attacking or destroying an object just because it happens to be there for the sake of destruction. So if you choose a target because of what it symbolizes, that's iconoclasm. And then we also talk about things like museum security, and security studies is a separate category. And then we also sometimes separate art in war because during war or conflict zones, the normal laws are not enforced. And so there's a different approach to stealing and protecting cultural heritage. So art crime is a really big business, bigger than people realize. It's been called among the highest grossing criminal trades worldwide, up there with the drug and arms trades. We don't have really good statistics to back that up, but it's been said often. And suffice to say, it's much more important to criminality than we realize. And it's also been a significant funding source for some terrorist groups. So whether or not you're interested in the art, it's something to take seriously. It happens all over the world. There are tens of thousands of reported art thefts every year, around 20,000 a year in Italy alone. But we tend to think of it in terms of, a few big museum heists that make the headlines, and then we forget about it the rest of the time. But in fact, this is happening all the time. So it's been fascinating to study, and there's all sorts of good stories involved with larger than life characters and amazing cinematic moments. But it's a proper criminological field of study now. And it's interesting to see how it functions within the network of organized crime and other crime types.
Okay, so we do have lots of audience questions here, so we'll get
Great.
to our
Okay.
audience here. One person asked, so much interesting information. How can I access the recording so you can watch it later? Once the Zoom is over, we'll have the recording up on the library's YouTube channel, which is at hudsonlibrary.org. We have a link to our YouTube channel. You can see all of our recorded programs from there. So we'll have that up in the next day or two. Anne asked, how many copies of the Mona Lisa are out there?
That's a good question. There are a lot. So I talk about, I think, eight different ones in a chapter in this book, but there's a lot more than that. The ones I talk about are the ones that were made roughly at the same time that Leonardo was alive. Sometimes it's hard to define exactly because there were a lot made in the second half of the 16th century when the Mona Lisa was on display as a favorite work of Francis I. It was actually on display in his toilette, which doesn't mean it was like in his bathroom. I like the idea that he's like sitting on the pot looking at the Mona Lisa. It wasn't exactly like that, but it was in his suite, his bathroom suite. Because it was famous um, as one of Francis I's favorite works of art, it was copied by a number of people in the French court at the time in the 16th century. But the ones that I find most interesting are the ones that were made roughly while Leonardo was alive, and some of them seem to have been made side by side with the original. So we're talking probably there's about 2 dozen that are good copies from the 16th century, and probably about 8 of them that are really intriguing, and maybe 3 or 4 that were made alongside the original in this studio.
Okay. Our next question, Pamela asked, any thoughts about works that are still missing from Boston's Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum?
Sure, this is the big white whale among art thefts. It's probably the highest grossing property theft in peacetime history. And the problem is that all the people who know where the art is are dead. So we're at this stage where it's at an impasse. I know some very good, very smart, well-connected detectives who are looking for it, but everybody's stuck. It's example of proof that everybody's stuck. A few years ago, the FBI had a press conference about it, and that's a really bad sign. Unless the FBI has a press conference to say, look what we've recovered, they only do it because they're totally stuck and hope that the press conference shakes out some information. So that was unfortunately a very bad sign. So in the short version is that much is known except where the works are now. And there are various theories about him. It might be in Ireland, it could be in the US still. But the people who actually know where are dead now. So I think we're in a monkeys at typewriter situation. By which I mean, at some point we're going to find them, but we're probably going to find them by accident when we don't realize we're looking for them. We're going to stumble upon them in the course of some other investigation. But I'm sure that they're still intact. There's no reason for them to have been destroyed. And it certainly makes for a good story.
Yeah, and I will just mention real quick since we're here, we do have, it's not up for registration just yet, but the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum is doing a presentation at the end of April for the library. So we look forward to that as well. A couple of our audience members have some questions. Noah, for you, where were you born? They wanted to know why Slovenia. Was it
Sure.
the artistic community, the galleries? What drew you to Slovenia?
So this is a good question. I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. My parents taught at Yale. I taught there in 2009 as well. Apparently, the first time the 3 members of the same family taught at the same time, so that was kind of fun. But when I was growing up, I went to a boarding school in Connecticut called Choate that had abroad programs, and I spent my junior year in France, and I just loved it. And from that point on, I thought, if I could live in Europe full time, I think that would be really fun to do. And so I did all my postgraduate studies in Europe, in England and Italy. And I wound up marrying a Slovene, but I was pretty flexible as to which country my future wife would be from, as long as it was somewhere in Europe, because I wanted to adopt this European lifestyle, which I really enjoyed. And part of that was because I like the sense of history, like the arts and culture there. I mean, actually, I would probably be pretty happy living in New Haven because I like that as a city in the U.S. But I always felt more at home in Europe, and so it was just a question of where the future Mrs. Charney would be from. But we lived in a number of different places. We lived in England, the Netherlands, Spain, and Italy before we decided to settle on Slovenia. So she's Slovene, but I did a bit of I'm going to say like kind of an objective research study about the best places to live if you can choose where you're going to live. And part of the benefit I have is I primarily work as a writer. And so it's very flexible as to my location. And Slovenia is about as idyllic a country as I can imagine. In fact, I actually wrote a book called Slovenology, Living and Traveling in the World's Best Country, about my adventures there and why I like it so much. And I think the short version of why I like it so much, it's very beautiful. It looks kind of like the end of The Sound of Music. It's right in the Alps. It's very friendly, easy to navigate. It's one of the safest countries in the world and one of the greenest, most ecological. But one of the things that pleasantly surprises Americans is they basically kept the good parts of socialism and got rid of the bad parts. And so the citizens are really well cared for in a way that surprises Americans. For example, maternity leave here, each person has 18 months paid maternity leave. And in the US, it's like 2 weeks unpaid or something like that. So there are these comparisons that people are like, really, how is that possible? And it's quite idyllic. And I've lived here more than 10 years, and I still feel like it's equally idyllic. Incidentally, if anybody's interested, I don't do tours often, but a couple times a year I lead a tour for a company called Atlas Obscura in Slovenia. And the theme is forest to table foraging. So it's basically like an eating tour with walking around in the mountains, foraging, eating things. We have lots of homemade schnapps tastings, and it's really good fun. So if anybody's interested, I can drop that link in. And I'll also mention if somebody were interested in learning more from me, I currently have an online course through Atlas Obscura on art forgery. And I'll just put the link in, and you could still sign up for that if you like. It's a 4-part course. So thank you for asking about Slovenia. Yeah, I'm a big fan. Last year, I was given the title of Ambassador of Tourism for Slovenia because I do a lot of promotion of Slovenia in the foreign media, and I'm really quite proud of it because I'm crazy about my adopted homeland.
Hannah asks, what's your opinion of recent media reporting that so many art museums now have forgeries in their collections that they thought were originals?
So that's nothing new. And the question is whether they have forgeries or they were just misattributed. And that's much more common. Forgeries of artworks are really uncommon. Um, but what is not uncommon at all is for works of art to be misattributed. And that doesn't mean a forgery takes place only if someone proactively decides to commit fraud involving a work of art. And so that is quite rare. Um, and this has been the case for basically the internet era onward. This has been in the news because with the internet era, all of a sudden, immediately people can identify where works of art are, where originals are, where copies might be. And it got much easier to sort of solve puzzles about works of art. I'll just give you an example of why a lot of American collections in particular have misattributed or rather over-attributed works. So many of America's biggest collections were made by the so-called robber barons in the Victorian and Edwardian eras, so circa, 1880s, 90s, 1900, around then. And this is a time when wealthy Americans often had much more money than the European aristocrats, and European aristocrats no longer had the feudal system to support them and had to sell off the trappings of their aristocracy, which included castles and titles and vineyards and works of art. And Americans were buying them, but they didn't really know about art and they weren't traveling to Europe themselves. They were usually using Europe-based agents to buy things for them. And the Europe-based agent, you can imagine, he's going to send a telegram back to, I don't know, Ford or Frick or JP Morgan and say, you know what, this is very exciting. I found a Rembrandt painting. It's an original, it's beautiful, it's a little expensive, but I can buy it for you. You want me to get it? And they'll say, sure, because the money isn't an issue and they want to have this trophy. Now imagine if the European agent is honest. He says, I found a painting. It looks like it might be by Rembrandt, but it might be by one of his students or a copy after Rembrandt, and it's really pretty cheap. Do you want me to get it for you? That would be like, wow, wow, that's not the least bit exciting for this wealthy collector. So there's a term that I use, non-malevolent wishful thinking. And I like this because I don't think that a lot of people in the art trade are trying to fool people, but I think a lot of them are very optimistic and overly enthusiastic and hoping for works to be authentic because everybody benefits if it is, and that happens quite a bit. And for example, the Albert Barnes Foundation, which used to be located outside of Philadelphia, when it moved to a new museum location in downtown Philadelphia, they reevaluated all the works in the collection, and most of the old master paintings were downgraded. They were not considered definitive works by masters, but probably copies after them or by their students. And this is due to over-enthusiastic European-based agents buying for American collectors.
All right, just a quick comment. Nancy said, fabulous presentation. Cannot wait to read this book and more.
Great, thank you.
Um, Let me look here. So one of our patrons says she lived in Ljubljana a couple decades ago and has
Ah,
read Stealing the Mystic Lamb, the Museum of Lost Art. How did you become interested in the theft of art?
so this goes back quite a ways, but also thank you for reading more than one of my books. You get extra credit. Um, so I had a weird origin story. I was studying in England, and I thought I wanted to either be an art historian or a playwright. And one of my advisors when I was an undergraduate at Colby College in Maine said, you know, you can teach yourself playwriting, but you can't really teach yourself art history. So I wound up going to London to study at a place called the Corto Institute, which is very famous among art historians, and otherwise nobody's heard of it. But it's the best place to go if you want to study art history. And then I did sort of independent course in playwriting by just going to lots of plays and writing. And I actually managed to get myself a playwriting agent while I was in London. And she said, plays are fine, but if you actually want to make a living as a writer, you should write a novel. Do you have one? And I said, no, but I'll go and write one. And just at this time, two things came out that you've probably all seen. One was the remake of the Thomas Crown Affair movie with Pierce Brosnan. That is a super fun. I still enjoy it. Super slick. You know, sometimes if you know too much about a subject, then movies about it are annoying because you see what they get wrong. This one's just fun. It's a pure pleasure, and I really recommend it. And also, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code came out. And I admired that book, but it's so full of factual errors that it really annoyed me, which was the case, I think, with a lot of scholars who read it. And I said, I'd like to write something that is that much fun, hopefully sells that many copies, didn't quite get there, but that has real research and facts in it. And so I just spent some time and I wrote what is my only novel that's published out of more than 20 books. I usually write nonfiction, but it's called The Art Thief, and it came out in 2007, and I was very lucky that it was an international bestseller and it allowed me to become a full-time writer. So I came about it because I researched for this novel and I realized that there was almost nothing written from a scholarly perspective. And I thought this would be kind of fun to do. And that's when I turned my attention to art crime. And I probably wouldn't have if it would have already been a robust field of study. But I found it very exciting that it really hadn't been approached before, and it felt like I could immediately make an impact.
Um, One of our patrons asked, is there another work of art that has a similarly interesting history? I'm a fan of Van Gogh, Klimt, and Charles Birchfield in particular. Have any of their works been fascinatingly stolen?
Oh yes, absolutely. So the probably the one story that I'm most interested in is the subject of a 2010 book of mine called Stealing the Mystic Lamb. And it's the true story of the Ghent altarpiece, which is the most frequently stolen artwork in history, and also arguably the single most important painting ever made. So it's got these two nice superlatives. So that's the book is Stealing the Mystic Lamb. I'll just put it in the chat. And that's great fun. Um, Two versions of Munch's The Scream were stolen on two separate occasions. And I sometimes write Ed videos, which are little animated videos that are shown in schools. And they get millions and millions of views. It's really fun to do. And one that I wrote about the Scream is coming out shortly. So you can keep an eye out for that. And there are lots of these good stories, man. You could do a good in-depth book about a lot of them. But just to answer briefly, I would say the Ghent altarpiece by Jan van Eyck is probably the one that has the most elaborate stories. There's 13 crimes or bad things happen to this one monumental painting over 600 years. Just about anything bad that could happen to a work of art did, but yet it still survives.
Okay. We'll take like just two more questions real quick here, and then we'll wrap up for our program today. Um, One of our patrons said, and I think a lot of people have the same, I mean, I can remember seeing it for myself, kind of this underwhelmed feeling of when you see the Mona Lisa, how surprised people often are that it's really quite small. Um, she just commented that the portrait in your presentation appears much larger than it actually was.
Yeah, it is smaller than people expect. And you know, I think that there's an element of the Louvre curation showing people, you know what, this is a great painting, but we got lots of great paintings here. I say in the book, there's both more and less than meets the eye to this painting. So one of the reasons it's the focus of so many kooky conspiracy theories is people want there to be more to it than there is. But if they knew enough about its real story, that would be plenty. That's kind of part of my point. And at least when I was living in Paris, the Mona Lisa was displayed on a wall surrounded by lots of other paintings that were much larger in a very busy room. And I remember thinking to myself, if this were in an American museum, it would be at the end of a long, dramatically lit corridor, and it would be this centerpiece because that's like the big thing that people are going to see. And here, the Louvre staff are just saying, this is one excellent Renaissance painting among many in our collection. And I think that that's on purpose. And it is smaller than people expect, but remember, it started off as a husband commissioning a portrait of his wife that they would have like in their living room. So it's not meant to be some giant masterpiece that's like the Ghent altarpiece weighs 1,500 kilos and is the size of a barn door because it was meant to be the central point of a cathedral. It's not like that. It's a little domestic portrait that uh, has this whole cult around it. And so, yeah, it is sometimes underwhelming when we see it in person, especially if you're hacking your way through walls of tourists who are all trying to take selfies in front of it. It takes some of the vibe away.
I think we'll end on this. Judy said everybody should read Charney's book, The 12-Hour Art Expert. And I guess you do 1 hour for each of the 12 chapters. So we'll
Yeah,
end
yeah,
on a
that's really
recommendation.
nice of you to say. That's one that I'm really pleased with because part of my goal is trying to remove the intimidation factor and the elitism that some people associate with art and art history. And trying to, I think there's no place for that. It's no fun at all. And it intimidates people sometimes and means that they don't approach the subject when they might really like it. So the idea of that book is if you buy only one book that's going to give you a little bit of a lot of different things about getting to know the art world in more depth, then that would be this one. And yeah, the idea is it would take you 12 hours to read, and that seems reasonable for people. And I've actually got a series of 12-hour books. I just finished one with my father, who writes about film, called The 12-Hour Film Expert. And right now I'm writing The 12-Hour Author, which is about how to write books and get published. And so it's been a fun theme to do with this publisher of mine. So thank you very much for mentioning it as something that you enjoyed.
It sounds like you're a busy person between teaching
Yeah,
full
yeah,
time and
far too many
writing.
projects.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate your time, and your book was absolutely intriguing, and your presentation today was equally as interesting. And we look forward to seeing what you have working on next.
Thank you so much. I'd love to be back for the next book. Have a good day, and
Great.
thank you all for
Thank
spending
you.
time with me.
Thank you.
Bye
You
bye.
too. Bye bye.